You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to the Conference Board's Indications podcast. Indications is a public podcast featuring our global roster of thought leaders. Topics range from economic growth and competitiveness to human capital, governance, sustainability, and beyond. Each episode is a serious conversation grounded in data and insights that will keep you ahead of the curve in a turbulent world. I am here with my colleague Lynn Franco, Senior Director of Economic Indicators and Surveys at the Conference Board. Welcome, Lynn. It's always great to speak with you.
Great to be back, Dana.
So let's discuss the most recent consumer confidence survey. Wow, consumer confidence improved in December, and there was an upward revision in November. What were the key drivers of the better prints in the 2 months?
Well, what we're seeing here is that, it's expectations that's really sort of driving the improvement in consumer confidence. So there's all indications here that, not only did the economy end on a solid footing in 2021, but that the growth is going to continue well into 2022.
That's really great to hear. And that's especially since the report was held right smack in the middle of news about the Omicron variant of COVID-19. What do consumers have to say about the new variant, if anything?
Well, what we're seeing is, that the concerns that they're voicing about, COVID-19, whether it was Delta or Omicron, has dissipated somewhat. Now, we sort of are still in the early stages and there's an expected winter surge. So we could see a little bit of a dampening in sentiment in the next month. But for right now, it seems that it's not phasing consumers.
Well, Lynn, you mentioned that expectations have really been driving activity, but I noticed that the present situation index dipped slightly. Can you tell us a little bit more about these movements?
Sure. What we're seeing in terms of the present situation was somewhat of a moderation. It went from 144.4 to 144.1. And we've seen that in terms of how consumers are rating business conditions, those that say conditions are good actually ticked up. And that's good because that tends to lead employment. And it was the employment question where we had a little bit of an easing in the number of consumers who are saying that jobs are plentiful. But that's at 55.1. And in a historical perspective, these readings are still at all-time highs. So consumers are still rating the overall job market very favorably. And if we look back a year, we've increased almost 57 points. The present situation last December was at 87.2. So we've come a long way in the last 12 months.
Indeed. So lots of good news in this report. So after taking a step backwards, buying plans really popped in December. Tell us more about that. Is it consistent with our holiday shopping survey?
Yes, we saw a nice bump in the percent of consumers who are saying they're willing to purchase an auto, a home, and even major appliances. And I think this correlates with what we saw in our holiday shopping survey, where, despite inflation concerns, consumers were ready, willing, and able to spend for the holiday season. And I think there's a desire to make this sort of a more festive season than it was last year, given we had many more restrictions at that point in time.
Indeed, I've seen much more lights outside. So in terms of buying plans, what else? The other thing that I found interesting was the desire to go on vacation. That ticked up in the month. Well, I guess we measure it every other month, but it was higher than the last measure. What does this tell us?
People are want to travel again, right? Whether it's for the holidays or just in general. So we've seen an uptick here, and it'll be interesting to watch this area in particular as sort of this winter surge unfolds, because we may see a bit of softening in sort of in-person activities, and vacation intentions may be one place where it's reflected.
Makes sense. One thing, though, that I found probably the most interesting after the headline print was 1 year inflation expectations. I mean, that gauge has been climbing month after month after month, but we saw it pull back in December. And even though consumer price inflation gauges are near 40-year highs, inflation expectations seem to soften a bit. How do we reconcile these two sets of data?
Well, yes, we did have a little bit of easing in inflation concerns in December. We were coming off a 13-year high in November, so concerns are still elevated. But I'm happy to report, at least on my end, that when I went to fill my car up, it cost me less at the pump than a few weeks prior. So perhaps the little bit of decline that we're seeing in gas prices is helping to ease some of those concerns, but they still remain elevated.
Fair enough. But I certainly welcome lower gas prices. So, what do you think? Were there any regional or income based differences in consumer confidence?
There always are, but I think, the takeaway here, especially when we look at sort of the states, is we've seen more increases than decreases, right? So we had of the 8 states that we survey, only two had declines, and they were very moderate, 5 points or less, which is relatively benign. And I think if you look across the board, we're just in much better shape than we were a year ago. It's a bumpy road, and it's going to continue to be a bumpy road, but I think we're on more solid footing than we were 12 months ago.
Well, I agree with you. We definitely are on much more solid footing, but there's still lots of uncertainties, especially with the Omicron variant and inflation. What do you think will be the important drivers to keep consumers optimistic going forward?
Well, employment is going to be one of the key ingredients for continuing high levels of consumer confidence. And all indications are at least that, we're going to continue to see tight labor market conditions, accelerated wage growth. I mean, that is all favorable for the consumer, not so much for the business leader. But we are going to face headwinds, right? So inflation remains a headwind, the pandemic remains a headwind. So we could continue to see a very bumpy road in the next couple of months.
Makes sense. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for such great insights. This has been Indications from the Conference Board. If you enjoyed this podcast, you may listen to additional The Conference Board offerings by going to www.conference-board.org/podcasts or find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.